Okay, that's where we left off. We are going to finish today with stuff on global warming, on climate change. It's going to take us both periods, but we are going to finish it today. And I have a few more little clips and more notes to give you. But let's start where we left off with last time. You guys got only this first one, right? That's where we stopped, I think. Is that correct? Because your class was ahead of you, I believe. Is that right? So you are... We went over the main one of this. I think there's a lot of little nitpicky things I can point out to you about why this first statement about CO2 driving temperature change is, if not completely and utterly false, certainly misleading. It's certainly not the major contributor to the greenhouse gases, and even the data that seems to be showing that with that correlation, that big graph over hundreds of thousands of years where the temperature is going up and the CO2 is going up. Turns out CO2 is following that. That's the biggest crazy part about this. Nobody talks about that. It may be a contributing factor. I'm not saying it's not. CO2 is definitely a greenhouse gas. No one's arguing that. But clearly it cannot be, over the course of millennia, it cannot be the thing that drove the temperature change. As you'll see today, what does drive those big changes, ups and downs, the ice ages. We'll talk about that a little bit today as well. All right. Even the IPCC, which, by the way, I haven't used that word before, but you'll hear it if you do a bunch of global warming stuff. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the UN body that puts out all of this research, compiles all of this stuff, and puts out all of its dire warnings, puts out predictions about what's going to happen. Even they have realized that the solar activity has a greater impact than they were realizing. As they've changed, even some of these, this is not in your thing, it's just from very recent, 2013. So I haven't put it in your notes, but basically even they've realized, the UN IPCC has basically realized that, you know what, things aren't going quite as hot as we thought they were going to. All of our models haven't shown this. So, it turns out maybe the sun's got a little bit more to do with it. And the sun's solar cycle has been decreasing over the last decade or so. And that's there's been fewer sunspots and less active sun. And so for that reason, temperatures have not gone up. Even they're admitting that the sun has a pretty big role in all of this. All right. But either way, that's only the first topic. There were a lot of other things, 6, I think, total, right? What about all those other ones? Well, this next one may seem like, isn't it the same one? Temperatures have risen dramatically due to man-made CO2. It seems like I'm talking about the same one yet. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to give you a couple of arguments even against the most obvious thing. Have temperatures risen over the past century? Absolutely. It has gotten warmer. Somebody asked the other day, well, just because it's not necessarily man-made CO2, does that mean there's no global warming? No. I think everyone would agree over the past century, I don't think, I know, you don't deny the facts, because we've actually measured temperatures. Over the past century, they have raised, they have gone up, but not exactly as much as you might think, okay? It's a really hot week this week, and next week, and it's September already. The tendency is to say that, well, geez, that's global warming. And of course, we know that's not right. I hope you know that's not right. A strong storm or a strong heat wave does not prove global warming, nor does a cold winter disprove global warming. However, there's some other things you need to know about this claim that the temperatures have risen dramatically due to man-made CO2. And the first one is the obvious. First, I want to start with a bad argument. You'll see stuff online on the sites that are against global warming. A chart like this, perhaps, okay? And is this chart even on your thing? I don't think it is. I just added this one very recently, too. Because if you look at this chart, and this is the headline from I think it was the Daily Mail or something like that, from the UK. Global warming stopped 16 years ago, Met Office reveals. All right, now, that's nonsense. I'm not going to lie to you the way Al Gore would lie to you. I'm not going to take one small set of data, start at a really high year like 1997 when the temperatures were very high, and then go to 2012 and say, look, it didn't increase over those 15 years, therefore global warming's over. Granted, it hasn't gone up very much or at all over the past 10 or 15 years. It may seem, when you keep hearing on the news how, this particular week was the hottest week on record. This month was the hottest month on record. And you hear that about the United States. Globally, temperature changes have not risen. But this is a bad argument. It's a bad argument for the same reason it's a bad argument when Al Gore tries to make it. You can't cherry pick data. You know what cherry picking means, right? You can't cherry pick data. Just what I want to show you. Because if I were to show you the graph from back here a minute ago, if I looked at just the data going up to here, I would say, oh my God, a couple of years from now, we're all going to be frying. If I looked at just the data going from here down to here, I'd say, well, we're going to global cooling. You can't do that. Climate doesn't change over the course of decades. It changes over the course of centuries. Okay, so I'm not going to lie to you and say, see, told you I was right, they were wrong, because that's nonsense. That's a bad argument. You can't cherry pick data and say because it hasn't gotten really warm lately, it means there's no global warming. All right, I'm going to give you some other arguments against this. And the first one is this graph. Not about teasing it out and looking at, gee, temperature change went up first and then CO2. Nah, I'm not talking about that now. Now I want you to realize something about this graph that I noticed 15 years ago when I first saw this. I noticed this. What's causing all this? Okay? There's clearly a cyclical pattern. This only goes back, this graph, let's go back 300,000 years. If you go back 650, I think that's the one Al Gore had on there, you see these big humps, up and down, up and down, up and down, right? There were no humans around to do that. We weren't burning fossil fuels 600,000 years ago. What caused that? So clearly it can't be man-made temperature rises way back then, right? Temperature rises, that's the claim, temperature rises have risen dramatically. I would say that the main driver of temperature rises, which we are coming out of a glaciation, we're coming out of an ice age, okay? The main driver of that is cyclical. It has to do with something I'm going to show you right now, a little video, a 2-minute clip that's going to explain kind of what goes on with the Earth and the sun. But my point is, it's not man-made. The vast majority of the temperature changes on this planet, the global climate changes, have nothing to do with man and have never had anything to do with man. It does not mean that we are not having some effect now, but my point is, you cannot make a correlation like Al Gore was trying to make, that just putting this much more CO2, this man-made CO2, is going to drive the temperature up that much. Can't be done. You have to understand first what drives most of our temperature. When I say most, I mean almost all of our temperature climate changes. And it has nothing to do, well, it certainly has something to do with greenhouse gases, but it has very little to do. Those cycles have very little to do with the greenhouse gases and much more to do with the sun and the earth, as you'll see. And man, has no influence on that, nor do women. Sorry, feminists, you have no influence on it either. Too bad. That's it. I'm going to get boycotted on YouTube for that statement. But it's true. Anthropogenic, let's use a Latin word instead of a sexist word like man or woman. What's that? Thank you. We will basically use anthropogenic global warming. What does it really do? Well, let me show you. Turn that light off. Have a nice. This one is not a long clip at all. It's about a minute. So don't blink or you're going to miss it. But it's going to help to explain something for you. Okay?
Way for dealing with every problem now, show and tell. Any other major event in human history has to do with the weather and the greenhouse effect is because both of them have a big effect on living conditions on the planet. For instance, really serious changes in the weather depend on how far we are from the sun. And every 100,000 years, that changes, because the shape of the Earth's orbit changes. And then every 41,000 years, the Earth tilts back and forwards, toward or away from the sun. And when it's tilted away, the ice caps get a lot colder. So when the Earth is farther from the sun in orbit and tilted away, it gets so cold you have yourself an ice age. The greenhouse effect kind of runs things in between those ice ages.
Okay, so you get that? All right. It really has, I told you it's only a minute. Backlight on. It really, those ups and downs over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, all right, they have they are not happening because some other species was putting out way more carbon dioxide and then it went up and then it went way down. It happens because of the Earth's orbit, okay, for the most part, and its tilt, okay? And we have, let me just say, we have zero control over that, zero control. And if I were worried, like I said before, considering the fact that over hundreds of thousands of years they've gone up and down and we're up here right now, I would be much more worried 10 to 20,000 years from now when we will not be here anyway. I would be much more worried about being down here at one of those dips. Why would I be worried about being down there at one of those dips? Because everything from Pennsylvania north is going to be one big glacier, a sheet of ice permanently year-round. That's what life is like in an ice age, okay? I don't want to live in that. Boulder Field, you've been to Boulder Field, right? That's where the last ice age, last glaciers retreated, okay? So that means everything above Boulder Field, New York, upstate New York, northern Pennsylvania, pretty much everything else above that, all of Canada, was a permanent sheet of ice. Which planet do you think can support more life? That one or the one we have right now when we're at the top of one of those things? Okay? Just common sense. All right, now, the second reason. They've been exaggerated. Temperature rises have been exaggerated. We're on the next page now. So the first reason is much of it is not man-made, it's cyclical. Regardless of how much Al Gore wants to put on his funny voice and say, this is a cyclical pattern, he can do that all day, all he wants. It's a fact. It is a cyclical pattern. All right? Besides that step, there's something else. Not we, as in me, but many of the people on the global warming side, scaremongering side, have been exaggerating these temperature changes for quite some time, for the past decade at least. Let me show you how. The first way is what's called the hockey stick graph. This thing looks like a hockey stick, and it's the first graph. I know you probably don't remember it. We're going through this stuff pretty quickly. But if you were to look back over the video from a couple days ago, when Al Gore, I let you watch all of Al Gore, just talk without me interrupting him. This is the first graph he showed you. This is a graph by Michael Mann. It was relatively new, back in around 2000. He came up with this graph, supposedly using different data, different kinds of techniques. And he came up with this graph. And that's the graph Al Gore showed you. And it's a pretty scary graph. Things are going along all hunky-dory here for quite a while. And then we get to the 20th century and bam, whoo, from here to there. And that's the graph you saw Al Gore put up there. Scary graph. If it's true, I'd be worried, except it's not. The hockey graph made by Michael Mann has several problems with it. First of all, a lot of the data in there was overemphasizing tree ring data, which is very uncertain. It's not anywhere near as accurate as other ways they have to measure temperature. Now, somebody asked me the other day, well, how do they measure temperature hundreds or even thousands of years ago or even millions of years ago? And I don't know. The honest to God truth is I am not that kind of a scientist. I don't know about, they measure the isotopes, the different kind of isotopes that are in the air, trapped at that level and that kind of stuff. And they also can measure the carbon dioxide levels at the same time. And they're able to determine the temperature. I'm assuming they're doing that correctly. I also have read about this particular graph. And the fact is, there's a lot of problems with it. That's one of the problems. Here's another problem. I'm going to pass these out to you because they're not also, there's something else that I added. Turns out that the computer program that Michael Mann used to generate this data pretty much turns everything into a hockey stick. I'm going to give you a paper. You can look at these 2 pages as I'm passing them around. You're copying that. This is a paper by, oh, actually, it's a speech by Michael Crichton that he gave. You guys know who Michael Crichton is? What did he write? What book did he write? A movie, for example. He did a lot of things. Jurassic Park, exactly. You guys remember the show? You probably don't. It was before your time. Remember the show ER on TV? Yeah. He did that. He was involved in that anyway. He was a doctor, and he actually never really practiced a whole lot, if at all, because he became famous for writing books and screenplays. But yeah. That's right, we did. I forgot about that. On the nuclear power, we were talking about Chernobyl one time, and I let you guys watch that. Remember that? Well, this, if you turn to the second page on this packet, you know, if you turn to the second page of this, on this packet, you'll see a couple of his argument, and you don't need to read all of this. I'm not going to ask you to repeat this word for word, but this is his argument. I copied this from his speech on his website, and he talks about the problems with the tree rings and the uncertainty of the data he used, and even the problems like when people ran the same data without making those mistakes, the corrected stuff. you get a totally different graph, which I'm going to show you in a second. But what I really want you to look at right now is this one right here, okay? Turns out that whatever you put, if you put just random data into that computer program he was using to generate his graph, it kind of looks like a hockey stick. So you got a lot of problems with this particular graph. The corrected data does not show this. And he also ignores, this last statement here, totally ignores the evidence for the medieval warm up, the medieval warm period, which again, Al Gore makes very good fun of in his first opening video I showed you. He makes fun of, there's that medieval warming period, and then he points to this scoffingly, and people laugh. It's just this little bump, because now we're up here, and that was the little bump in the medieval warm period. Now, I want to show you what the graph would look like if you did it correctly, and also what all the graphs that I ever saw before Michael Mann came out from Penn State and showed this one. I want to show you some of the other stuff, okay? All right, this is what I've always seen. This is much more what I've seen over the past couple of centuries. You have this medieval warm period, you had a little ice age, and then we're somewhere around here. Not far from this height right here. Maybe a little bit higher now. All right, but certainly not this versus that was the medieval warm period. His just disappears the way he did his data. It just disappears. Now sometimes it does happen that better ways of measuring things come along, and we do throw out old stuff. But he completely ignored stuff, and he did a poor job, according to a lot of other scientists. When the Canadian scientists ran the same data, they didn't get this graph. They got something completely different. Still, you will find this graph used extensively on the internet, which is no surprise because the internet isn't going to be, Wikipedia is probably going to have this on, I don't know. But this kind of a graph has become, at the very least, controversial. Michael Mann's also controversial for his emails, where he talks about covering up things so that, we can't let the public know about how we kind of trick the data. That was his own phrase, trick the data to make it show what we want it to show. They had this, you know how emails have become a big deal. Hillary Clinton running for, you've heard about that, right? And the WikiLeaks, that kind of stuff. Well, there was that kind of a thing where a guy hacked emails and then released them to the public. And some of the ones from him were kind of damning because he was talking about how he was trying to, trick his data to show one thing versus another. So he's become a pretty controversial figure. Of course, not in the global warming community. He's still, a hero, like many of the other guys, Hansen and these other guys who are heroes in this particular fight that they see as a holy war. All right, I'll get you the papers in a second. Hold on. But if you run that same stuff, the corrected version, his own stuff looks more like this. Notice the medieval warm period is back. All right, and this is the old data. It looked like a hockey stick. All right, it's not quite like that anymore. So my next argument against the rapid and unprecedented rise is that it's been exaggerated, mainly by this. It's amazing how one small piece of bad information hangs around for a long time. John Stossel, one of the videos I'll show you, talks about how errors in science often make it into print, and then they're just hard to get rid of. Spinach. Spinach is so good for you because it's got all this iron in it. It was a mistake. A guy misplaced the decimal point in his data, and everybody thought spinach had 10 times the amount of iron in it than it really had. And that's still, to this day, you think spinach is the healthiest food around, has so much iron in it. And it's just not true. There's a lot of things like that. This particular graph has become very controversial, but you'd never know it because if all you do is go to the global warming websites, they will not point out the fact that Michael Mann had those emails that kind of called it into question, that other people have used his data and not come up with a graph like this, that his own computer program came up with a graph like this for almost anything, and that he totally ignores the historical evidence for a medieval warm period. I'll save that for when we talk about the Greenland ice cap. But, all right, so there you go. So that's the second way. Now here's the third way. I told you before, a lot of this was, let me get to this next. Which one is this one on? Placement. I'll get you the other ones later, Lexi. But here's where we are right now. These are two that you'll get. All right. Remember I said yesterday that the correlation of the warming was wrong in both place and time for CO2? The The place was the fact that all of the computer models predict that you should get warming in the upper atmosphere. You should get a hot spot of warming. Okay, instead, what have we got? We've gotten a lot of warming at the surface, but none measured in the upper atmosphere by either satellite data or weather balloon data. That's missing from the models. And all the models predict this. It hasn't happened. What's going on here? Well, I'll tell you one of the things that's going on here. Bad placement. How do they measure the temperature at the surface? You've seen boxes around, probably around maybe around town or other places, where they actually are weather stations that measure temperature. Turns out, a lot of those weather stations, a lot of those temperature sensors are placed in really bad areas. Areas that may not have been bad 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, but because of urban sprawl or because of the changing landscape, are now registering higher temperatures than would have been registered 20 or 30 years ago. Here's why. Take a look at where some of these are placed. This one's placed over a sewage treatment plant, which gives off heat. This one's placed, there's a running air conditioner. You know what the outside of an air conditioner looks like, these air conditioners? What are they blowing out? Hot air. All right? Here, I love this one. You see this one? That's a fence, nice little fence around a parking lot. Now, what does the macadam do? It absorbs that heat, and it radiates it off to the sensor. Many of these sensors are placed in very bad areas. And even if they weren't, you have to take into account the fact that we live in a more urban civilization than we did 50 years ago. What's happened? Something called urban sprawl. You know what urban sprawl means? The cities just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're paving over more, you're cutting down more trees. So what maybe at one time was out in the middle of a field is now next to a factory. 40 years ago, maybe that was in the middle of a field. Now there's a factory there. Is it going to be warmer there because the climate's changed? Or is it warmer there because we have an air conditioner blowing on it 24/7? See what I'm saying? And you say, how much does that really happen? Well, you'll be surprised to know a lot. Take a look at some of these examples. Again, these are all your things. You don't have to memorize. I said there's a lot of stuff in here I threw in here so you could read it if you wanted to, if you're interested. You don't have to memorize this stuff. Redding, California, one's boxed with a halogen light inside. Another one is on top of a gravestone. That's going to obviously also absorb heat. In a parking lot near a paved tennis court. Tennis courts are like 10, 15 degrees warmer. Anybody who plays tennis knows that. All of these guys here, on top of the sewage treatment plant, all of these guys would be, and they're still used. They're still used, but they certainly aren't getting an accurate measure of the temperature around it. All right. Here's so much so that even the federal government has started. This one's not in your papers. It's not. I saw another new one from 2013. Because of complaints by people like me, because of complaints by people on the other side about how badly these sensors are placed, the federal government has removed 600 of them that were so badly placed they had no argument for it. They had to move them. All right, but there are still, this guy still claims there are thousands of others that are still around that they didn't move. But only recently have they moved those. So the data you're looking at, for any time you see data that's supposed to be incontrovertible data, you're probably seeing data that has been skewed high because of what's called the heat island effect. Heat islands. Like Atlanta, they say, is so big now and gets so hot, it actually generates enough heat and enough updraft to generate its own storms. That's how hot the city gets. It's just so much hotter in there, And of course, as these things have spread out and our temperature sensors have remained where they were 40 years ago, that shows an increase in temperature that wasn't necessarily there. Okay? All right. So they use selective temperature data. All right? Even when, write this one down, even though some of these sensors are bad, it's bad enough some of the sensors are misplaced. They've also gotten rid of some that were placed in the cooler areas. A perfect example of this is right here. All right? In the 1970s, there were 600 Canadian weather stations fed into the computer models surface temperatures. 600 in Canada. Now, Canada's a cool spot, right? You know how many they have today? 35. Okay? if you read the rest of these, there's other examples of that as you read these. So I'm just giving you, they're selectively cherry picking again. Which ones will be warmer and which ones will be colder we get rid of. That's not fair. You have to have an accurate way of measuring temperatures. And what has shown the most increase? Has it been where they expected by the models in the upper atmosphere? No, it's been on the surface, which is absolutely fits with the fact that we have sensors that are placed in parking lots and sewage treatment plants and air conditioners. And so, of course, that's going to show a higher temperature over the last 30 or 40 years. All right. Now, these next three, I'm going to show you a little, you have that page, I think, right? Okay. This one I'm going to show you another clip, little video clip here for, it's only going to take me a few minutes, but I know, instead of starting and stopping, I'm going to cover three things at once here. And it's only going to take me, it's still only going to be about 5 minutes long for the clip, maybe 6. Glaciers melting, storms getting worse. That's the big one. Barack Obama mentioned it up in Alaska just yesterday. You know, and he also was standing next to a glacier yesterday and talked about how these are all going to be gone someday, and our children aren't going to be able to see this because this was a melting glacier which is retreating. So there's glaciers, storminess, and sea level rise. Now, instead of starting and stopping, I'll just show you the clip. At the most, it's 10 minutes long. Turn that light up.
The untrained are
hysterical because the global warming story goes in the trash can, so does your job. It really is that crude. And the reporting has to get more and more hysterical because there are still, fortunately, a few hardened news editors around who will say, you know, this is what you were saying 5 years ago. But now it's much, much worse. You know, there's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise by next Tuesday or something. They have to keep on getting shriller and shriller and shriller.
It is now common in the media to lay the blame for every storm or hurricane on global warming. But is there any scientific basis for this?
This is purely propaganda. Every textbook in meteorology is telling you the main source of weather disturbances is the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole. And we're told in a warmer world, this difference will get less. Now that would tell you you'll have less storminess, you'll have less variability. But for some reason, that isn't considered catastrophic. So you're told the opposite.
News reports frequently argue that even a mild increase in global temperature could lead to a catastrophic melting of the polar ice caps. But what does Earth's climate history tell us?
We happen to have temperature records of Greenland that go back thousands of years. Greenland has been much warmer. Just 1,000 years ago, Greenland was warmer than it is today, yet it didn't have a dramatic melting event.
Even if we talk about something like permafrost, a great deal of the permafrost, that icy layer under the forests of Russia, for example, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago melted far more than we're having any evidence about it melting now. So in other words, this is a historical pattern again, but the world didn't come to a crunching halt.
Professor Siunishi Akasofu is head of the International Arctic Research Center.
By the way, I'm going to pause it here because the last three guys that were on here are scientists, and I noticed some people who are, you know, we live in Berwick, so we're kind of racist, aren't we? You know, you hear the name and you're already smirking. These are real scientists. That's the whole point. They aren't supposed to look good on TV, okay? And they may talk with a funny accent. But the fact is, you've been told that all scientists agree. We're global. These are real scientists. These are real meteorologists, and geologists, and climatologists who have a different opinion that never gets out there. And you know, we're told that nobody who has any brains could possibly argue against global warming. You must be a moron if you do. These people ain't morons. They are PhD professors and research scientists who believe this.
In Alaska, the IARC is the world's leading Arctic research institute. Professor Akasofu insists that over time, the ice caps are always naturally expanding and contracting.
The reports from time to time, big chunk of ice break away from the Antarctic continent. Those must have been happening all the time. But because now we have a satellite that can detect those, that's why they become the news.
This data from NASA's meteorological satellites shows the huge natural expansion and contraction of the polar sea ice taking place in the 1990s.
Practically all the TV programs that relate to global warming show big chunk of ice falling from the edge of the glaciers. But people forget that ice is always moving.
News reports frequently show images of ice breaking from the edge of the Arctic. What they don't say is that this is as ordinary an event in the Arctic as falling leaves on an English autumn day.
They ask me, did you see ice falling from the edge of the glaciers? Yes, that's the spring breakup. That happens every year. Press come to us all the time, I want to see something that the greenhouse disaster. I say there's none.
Alarming television programs raise the fearful prospect of vast tidal waves flooding Britain. But what causes the sea level to change, and how fast does it happen?
Sea level changes over the world in general are governed fundamentally by two factors. What we would call local factors, the relationship of the sea to the land, which often, by the way, is to do with the land rising or falling than anything to do with the sea. But if you're talking about what we call eustatic changes of sea, worldwide changes of sea, that's through the thermal expansion of the oceans, nothing to do with melting ice. And that's an enormously slow and long process.
People say, oh, I see the ocean doing this last year. That means that something changed in the atmosphere last year. And this is not necessarily true at all. In fact, it's actually quite unlikely because it can take hundreds to thousands of years for the deep ocean to respond to forces and changes that are taking place at the surface.
It is also suggested.
Okay, so I'm not going to, the bell's going to ring in about 5 or 6 minutes. I want to just finish one of these, of the three. The three things they mentioned in that little clip were the melting ice, the melting poles, the melting glaciers. Okay, that's one thing. I want to talk about that one, and that's the only one I'll get to. And they'll also mentioned about the rising sea levels and storminess. We'll get to those as the last part when we start the next class. So let's just take the glaciers and melting part. Okay. Now, I'm not going to, again, I don't want to lie to you. Well, there's a couple of reasons why when Al Gore is showing you those pictures of the glaciers, it's correct, but there's also ways that he's exaggerating it. Depending on when I take the picture, a glacier or the Himalayas or certainly the Arctic is going to, you saw the expansion and contraction over the course of a year of the Arctic ice circle. Okay, it's going to always be growing. So if I take it in the summer and if I look at ice calving off of a glacier, it looks pretty bad. But if I look in the winter, it doesn't look so bad. So, I'm sure the pictures he was showing, some of them were a little deceptive. However, he's correct. Many glaciers, including in the Himalayas, are retreating, including in Alaska. They are retreating. They are going away. All right, how worried do we have to be? Well, first of all, I will make the point that the data that he was quoting about the Himalayan glacier being gone by 2035, that's what he quotes in there. I got to show you where that came from because it's shockingly bad data. Here's the reason why it's shockingly bad data. It's not data at all. It's based on a phone call to a guy by a pop science magazine. And that made it into the IPCC report that year. Watch. Check this out. Okay? I want to kind of read almost all of this here. We've been told that the Himalayan glaciers are going to be gone by 2035. That's only 20 years from now. Gone. No more glaciers. Al Gore says if that happens, lots of people, millions of people will be without drinking water. That's what he said. Okay. 2 years ago, the IPCC issued a benchmark report that was claimed to incorporate the latest and most detailed research into the impact of global warming. Central claim of this thing was, by the way, this is 2 years from whenever this article was. That was a little while ago. That the glaciers were melting so fast that those in the Himalayas could vanish by 2035. Turns out, where did that information come from? Take a look at this. It's pretty amazing. It was based on a news story in a pop science magazine called The New Scientist. Kind of like Time or Newsweek kind of magazine. That level of not a journal, or a journal like a Journal of American Medicine, Medical Journal, whatever that, JAMA, or no, not the New England Journal of Medicine. This is a pop science magazine, like Popular Mechanics is a pop mechanics magazine. So it was based on a story in there. Well, you say, okay, and that was published 8 years earlier. Okay, well, where did that come from? Well, they traced it, they tracked it down. Turned out that the New Scientist report, that story, was based on a short telephone interview with a guy, I cannot pronounce his name, a little known, not like tops in his field, Indian scientist, then based in, I can't pronounce that either, in Delhi, okay? This guy, when they contacted him, has since admitted that his claim was speculation. It wasn't based on his research or anyone's research. It wasn't based on anything. He just said, well, you know what? Yeah, things keep going the way they are. They could be gone by 2035. That makes it into the IPCC report, and Al Gore, and makes it into Al Gore's movie, and everyone thinks we're all going to die real soon, and we're not going to have any drinking water for the end. And it's terrible. It's a terrible way to do science, okay? And here's the last thing I'm going to say before the bell rings, okay? The Antarctic ice. Did anybody ever tell you we actually are getting more ice in the Antarctic? It's actually increasing. It's expanding, not shrinking. Yep. Say, well, is that a big deal? Here's how big of a deal that is. The Antarctic is way bigger than the Arctic. Way bigger. Okay, way more ice there. As a matter of fact, 90%, you might want to highlight or underline this, 90% of the Earth's ice and 80% of its fresh water is in the Antarctic. That's pretty shocking, isn't it? Here we are worried about, a couple of glaciers retreating, and the Arctic is shrinking, no doubt about it, getting smaller every year. Although, interesting part about the Arctic, check this next one out. Last year, again, bad argument. If I wanted to be deceiving, if I wanted to be deceitful, I could say, see, proved it. Arctic ice up 60% in 2013. Up 60% over the previous year. But that would be a deceiving argument because, first of all, the reason it's up 60%, we all know it expands and contracts. All right, but the reason is because 2012 happened to be a very, very low year for ice. Okay, but in fact, the Arctic ice has not steadily been dropping, but it has overall, as a trend, been dropping. But the Antarctic has been growing. And some glaciers are retreating. Some actually are advancing. Not as many as are retreating. You ever wonder, he mentioned about the Greenland ice cap, if that melts, sea levels are going to rise. If that melts and something else melts, 20 feet of sea level rise. Guys, like the other guy said in the movie, 1,000 years ago, Greenland was warmer. Do you ever wonder if Greenland has a ice, glacier over it all the time, how did it get its name Greenland? Were they lying?
I think there's a story between that. Apparently the Vikings settled in.
The Vikings did settle Greenland.
Both of them. One of them, and they said was for Iceland's kind of. They wanted.
Well, you're talking about Iceland. It was part of it was propaganda. Yeah. But part of it was there were settlements on Greenland. Because Greenland was much warmer just 1,000 years ago than it is today. Much more of the ice was not there. And the world didn't end. All right? The world did not end, and the oceans didn't rise 20 feet. My point is, Greenland used to be green. It used to have a lot more of that melted than it is now. All right? Then the little ice age. They settled that. The Vikings settled it. And then they all died off. You know why? Because we went into that little ice age. Remember the medieval warm period and the ice age? In the little ice age, they couldn't survive there anymore because the winters became longer and the summers became shorter and they couldn't grow crops and they all died. Or they moved, one or the other. Okay? All right, that's the bell, I think, in 10 seconds. So I'll stop it here and we'll finish this up next period.